Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Joni Johnston. Welcome to Unmasking a Murderer. I'm a forensic psychologist, private investigator, and crime writer. And this video is going to be a little bit different than some of my other ones because it's going to be a little bit shorter. And it's in response to some breaking news, which I don't normally do. I like to typically wait until we have a lot more information and things unfold. And of course, until somebody goes to trial and is convicted. We're all innocent until proven guilty. But given that this person who's been arrested as of today is an alleged serial killer, and since I wrote a book about serial killers, I thought it would be maybe interesting to talk a little bit about what has come out in the press conference and those kinds of things. So this is regarding the Gilgo Beach murders. They've been called the Long Island murders, Long Island serial killer, Gilgo Beach serial killer, lots of different names. This has been going on for many, many years now. Some of these date back to 2010, 2011. And I'm not going to go through a lot of the details of the actual case because there's so much information out there. And, I'm sure there's lots of great information already, people coming on talking about the specifics of the case. I'm going to talk about it more from a psychological perspective. So the alleged killer is an architect who's 59 years old who lives on Long Island. By the name is Rex Hauerman, I believe is how you say that. You can tell this is breaking news. So I'm hoping that's right. He's married. I think he has 2 kids, from what I've been reading, which is, I read the same things you do in terms of trying to get information about his family and those kinds of things. He has a daughter who's, I think, in her 20s, and he also has a partially disabled son. Neighbors and friends, I guess mainly neighbors so far, have talked about his family being very nice, but very quiet and a kind of a loner family. They kind of keep to themselves. And there've been several comments made about the house being relatively unkept in comparison to some of the neighbors. So I don't know what that means psychologically, but I think it's information that I wanted to throw out there. But I think what I did want to talk about is the evidence that's come forward so far and what that might suggest in terms of what kind of serial killer might have committed these murders. As we all know, I think at this point, especially if you're a true crime aficionado, is that serial killers are really diverse. They're diverse, gender-wise, they're diverse race-wise, and they're also diverse in terms of motives. And so we oftentimes think of sexually motivated serial killers because they're the ones who tend to get the most media attention. We think of Ted Bundy, we think of John Wayne Gacy, we think of Richard Ramirez, and those were all sexually motivated serial killers. That is not, though, the number one motive. For most serial killers. We don't often think about, for example, a woman who bumps off husbands consecutively for money as being a serial killer. But when we think about the definition of serial killer, depending upon what definition you use, is basically just the number of murders you've committed over a period of time. And if you've committed 2, and in some definitions, 3 or more murders in separate instances, you are a serial killer. So again, we had this image in our mind, I think, of these sexually motivated serial killers. Now, when we're talking about somebody who would solicit sex from someone, young women who might be advertising escort services on Craigslist, which I think was this particular perpetrator, again, whether it's the person who's been accused or not, we know that these victims were solicited through Craigslist and then were subsequently sexually assaulted and murdered. When you think about somebody who would solicit people for sex and then murder them, that certainly does point us in the direction of this being a sexually motivated serial murderer. But what's kind of interesting is that even among sexually motivated serial killers, there's some diversity there as well in terms of motive. So for example, you might have somebody who is really interested in the sexual assault and then murders his victims because he doesn't want to get caught. So it's what we call like an instrumental murder. It's for a purpose. It's for an obvious purpose. I don't want to go to jail, or I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to get caught. And so I'm really interested in controlling this person, sexually assaulting this person. And then the murder is kind of an afterthought. I don't really get pleasure out of the murder. I just get pleasure out of the sexual assault. And then you have murderers who sometimes will say, I'm a murderer. Gary Ridgway, who was the Green River killer, it was kind of interesting because this is a man who, until Samuel Little came along, had killed more women in the United States than anybody else. And he was somebody who would solicit primarily sex workers or women who had drug problems, women who were vulnerable in some way. And he would rape them and then he would murder them. He would strangle them. And he had a very specific way of getting behind them and strangling them. And it was interesting because for him, he talked about a lot of rage toward women, a lot of hatred toward women, and he really would kind of rail at this idea that he was a, rapist or serial rapist and murderer. He would say, "I'm not a serial rapist, I'm a serial killer." Well, if you are raping and then murdering anybody, you are a serial rapist and serial killer. But he really had a problem with that because for him, it was really about this anger and about this rage that kind of got mixed up with sex. And so he really would say, it isn't about the sex, it's really about the killing and the murder. That's really what I get off on. And then there's another kind of sexually motivated serial killer, which I think is really the scariest in some respects, because it's almost like it's not so much the actual death of their victim. It's not so much the actual penetration of their victim. It's the suffering of their victim that really is the most pleasurable to them. And this person is what we call a sexual sadist. And sexual sadism is a paraphilia, which means it's a sexual deviance. We have no idea really what causes this. There's all kinds of theories out there about, anger and control and rage and sex getting fused at some point, but we don't really know. But what we do know is, number one, it's very difficult to treat. And number two, when it is present in conjunction with psychopathy, it's probably the most dangerous type of predator. Because you think about it, somebody who meets the definition, and I'm talking about the clinical definition of psychopathy, most psychopaths do not kill anybody. They're not violent. The ones who are violent tend to be violent for some specific reason. You're in my way. You are preventing me from getting some goal that I have. So it's almost like a purposeful, maybe premeditated, but it's not like they're getting off necessarily on the killing as much as it's just, I got to get rid of you because you're not giving me what I want, or you're standing in the way of something that I want. What sexual sadism and what psychopathy can have in common or overlap is this lack of empathy and this tendency to kind of dehumanize other people. And there's this emotional detachment. And when you have somebody who has psychopathy as a foundation, and then for whatever reason, they've developed this sexual deviance, this sexual sadism, it's really frightening, because what that tells us is this is somebody who has really no capacity to empathize with anybody, and particularly their victims, because their victims aren't human necessarily to them. It's like a means to an end. You're an object for me. And the sexual sadism part of it means that the pleasure is the pain and suffering of other people. And what makes me concerned that, what we've heard so far, that this is this type of perpetrator, is because the alleged perpetrator here, Mr. Hauerman, apparently did a couple of things that were pretty consistent with this kind of murderer. This is somebody who apparently really looked at a tremendous amount of sadistic porn or pornography. And that's of concern because, of course, the kind of pornography we consume tells us a lot about our sexual preferences, about our sexual interest, our sexual fantasies. So there's a tremendous, apparently, amount of sexually sadistic pornography that's discovered. And another thing that he did, which you often find with sexually sadistic serial killers, is they will find a way to somehow relive that, sometimes even by contacting family members or taunting them or taunting the police. And apparently, whoever killed these women contacted at least one family member, a sister, a young sister of one of the victims, on at least 4 occasions, and taunted her by giving her all these details about what he did, told her that her sister was dead, said a lot of sexually suggestive things to her. And you think about that. I mean, that is such a cruel thing to do. It really is pouring gasoline on a very, very painful fire that a family is already going through. And so I do, it scares me to think about what these victims, if this person does fit in this category, and we'll know a lot more, in the days to come, it really does it scares me and saddens me to think about what these victims may have gone through before they died. So anyway, those are my comments, my initial comments on this case. I'm sure we'll revisit this. I've gotten some phone calls already about being on other podcasts, and that's what sparked my decision to do one for you, at least a brief one, because I was thinking I've done a lot of research on this, and I do a lot of talks on different podcasts and shows, and I do a lot of research about paraphilias and sexually motivated killers. And so I thought it'd be interesting to talk about what kind of combination of personality characteristics, mental illnesses. And, we don't tend to think of a paraphilia as a mental illness. And I don't think it is in the same sense that depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia is, but you do find that in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. And, another challenge is that when you look at, paraphilias is oftentimes, almost always when somebody has sexual sadism, they don't want to get treatment. The problem isn't them. They want to get pleasure hurting other people. And the reason I think that we see in sexually motivated serial killers, sometimes we see this kind of combination, is kind of what I call psychopathy plus, because it takes more than somebody being psychopathic to do this kind of thing. It takes the foundation of psychopathy in combination with this paraphilia, with this sexual deviance that then can result in this, over a long period of time, these fantasies that become increasingly, I guess, vivid. And at some point, of course, fantasies become planning and planning becomes action. And we end up with a situation like this. And it also makes sense that if somebody is targeting strangers, targeting vulnerable strangers, that it would be in many respects the hardest kind of person to catch. And we look at historically and kind of go, well, are there other examples of kind of sexually sadistic serial killers? I mean, one that stands out the most to me is Ted Bundy. There are other ones because he very much kind of fit into that category. So I welcome your comments for those of you who drop in every month or so to see if I've actually posted another video. If you like this, please subscribe and tell your friends and all that. I've got to get better about doing that. I hope everything's going well with everybody, and I will talk to you soon when we unmask another murderer.